if you own a small business, hiring someone is more than just interviewing and offering them a position to the right candidate. You got to maintain an employee file, and today we're going to be discussing why this is important of having a written application and why you should always keep one on file as well. As always, I'm joined by Beverly Smith with Career Staffing Services and Glenda Caton of Caton HR Consulting. How are you guys doing today?
Fabulous.
Awesome.
Sorry.
Only one's fabulous, the other one's not fabulous. Well, Glenda, since you're doing fabulous, we're going to pass the first question on to you then.
Good.
So, why does a business need to keep a written or electronic application? What's the purpose of that specifically?
The purpose of it is so you always have it to refer back to. You're asking questions. Are you able to get to and from work? Do you have a reliable transportation to and from work? Questions like that. Are you available? What days are you available? And you're like, they mark all the days, and then all of a sudden they can't work Saturdays and Sundays. Mm-hmm. Well, then they've given false information on their application, right? An application is a legal document, so you can use that, and they sign an attestation at the bottom saying everything they put on there is true. So you can always use that if you need to maybe people could be successful somewhere else. That's my catchphrase. Like, in case you need to fire somebody. Just kidding. Sorry. So it's very important that you keep that application on file. And like we said in another episode, like you want to keep it for at least a year after the candidate has applied, even if you don't hire them. In case there's ever a discrimination claim or anything like that. So.
That was going to be my question: is why would you want to keep it on file for discrimination lawsuits or any sort of claims that they might bring back to you?
Yeah, definitely. One is to prove your application wasn't asking them what their age, race, sexual orientation, or any of those other things are. In case somebody says, well, I didn't get hired because I was discriminated against it because they asked this question. You're like, no, this is it. And this is the reason why you didn't get hired. You're not available on Sundays, and we operate 7 days a week, and that's an important day for us. So you just want to have it so that you can reflect back on and bring it up anytime you need to. But I think it's just important to have that so that if anything ever comes up from, an EEOC claim or Department of Labor or anything, and then there are some industries where those are audited, like for compliance, and that's not a legal thing; it's an industry or contract specific thing. So if that's where if you're governed under that, then you need to keep them as long as that agency tells you to.
Gotcha. So. And so, Beverly, if a job seeker submits a resume, why should this not be used in place of an application? What's the difference between those?
So, yeah, and I think as a small business, it would be just easy just to take that resume. But here's the problem with that. Glenda's already said, an application is a legal document, but a resume is not. So, with a resume, you can falsify or just kind of fudge different stuff. But once you put something on an application and you sign your name to that, you're committing that information that you put on there is true. And so a good application will have a place to sign off and say, these things that I'm telling you are true and correct to the best of my knowledge. And therefore, if something comes up down the road where they have told you one thing, that they're skilled or in this area, or they've worked for a certain employer for a certain amount of time, and then as you go and check your references and things like that, you discover that instead of 3 years that they worked there 3 months, you've got grounds.
That doesn't happen.
Yeah, you've got grounds not to hire that person. You've got a lot of other things that might come up over time where you go back and say, I think the example of the schedule was a great example there, where you've told me you can work all these days, and now you're not available to work Sunday, and I need you to be able to do that. So that is why. So, but a resume is definitely not a legal document. I would add too that with a resume, you can take notes all over that, but you can't with an application. So the application is in their writing or things like that. And I think you could probably speak more as to why that is the case. But with the resume, you can take all your notes that you want.
Yeah, well, I just think it's because it's a legal document that they've committed to and they've completed, And with the resume, it's just not like the Department of Labor is not going to come in and say, let me see all your resumes. Like, no. But with the application, they're going to be like, let me see your file. Let me see, so.
I remember in the early days of our staffing company when everything was on paper, we had a note section that we could write on the back of our application where we could take the notes, but we weren't supposed to take them all over the application. And we were to use the same color ink all throughout the process. There was not to be red ink on some, blue ink on others, because it could be that you're color coding applications to mean a certain thing. Nowadays, where most of that's digital, you don't have that.
Mm-hmm.
And I've recently read somewhere where differences between resumes and applications, someone had said a resume is not like a tattoo where it's permanent. You can always go and change that, whereas an application, it is going to be permanent and it should be gotten right.
Yeah.
You just go wipe that off.
Well, Glenda, what should be included on an application specifically and what should be avoided? That way there's no any EEOC claims or anything that would lead a company to be in trouble for that.
Well, that was a great lead in. So at the very top of your application, you should have an EEO statement saying that you are not going to discriminate against, all the different classes, and you're going to honor that. And then you want, obviously, your general contact information so you can call them and let them know you'd like to speak with them further. Then references, and not necessarily in the same or the right order, but you want to have references. You want to have previous employers. You want to have skills, special certifications, if that's something that, this position is requiring. And then at the bottom, like we've mentioned a couple of different times, you want to have that place where they're saying, I attest that everything on here is true and correct, and sign and date. Things that should not be on there. You should not ask people for their social security numbers. You should not ask them for their dates of birth. If you do background checks and drug screens, some are required to. It's not just optional, but by federal guidelines or whatever, maybe they have contracts. But so instead of asking, we used to, have you been convicted of any felonies within the last 7 years? And that's like a huge no. Are you on any drugs? Do you, which, by the way, another thing that you should have on there is, are you capable of performing the essential functions of the job with or without accommodation? So that should definitely be on there. And so you want to phrase that like, would you, if chosen for the position, will you submit to a background check and drug screen as a condition of employment? Instead of saying, do you own a car, you want to say, do you have reliable transportation to and from work? Because when you ask, do you own a car, there are certain classes of people that are just, they don't typically own one, or that's kind of the perception, or even statistically. And so you don't want to utilize that, because then they're saying it can come back later and say, well, they knew that I was, this race in this age category, so they didn't hire me for that. Do you have a disability? Are you on medications? Like nothing like that. And I've seen it all.
Just
like
the
even
facts,
with
ma'am.
a 1,200 person organization, and this was their. They asked that, and I was like, oh my gosh, are you asking people to list their medications on here? Like, no, sometimes ignorance is bliss. You don't want to know that, number one. Number two, it's going to come back and bite you, because if you don't hire them, you discriminated against them because they are on medication that they have to function every day. So you just want to be very, very careful about that. And your application is going to go into a separate file as like your payroll information and stuff like that. So that's why you don't want to, it's not necessarily the one that, you don't want to have any confidential information on it, basically. So yeah, what else? What do you think?
I think you pretty much nailed it. I would say too that it's just, as a business owner, you don't want to rule people out with your questions on your application, because you mentioned like someone must have medication to function, and maybe your connotations of someone being on that medication is a certain way because that's someone you've known in your life was on that, but you don't realize that this person is completely functional, and you may be ruling out one of your best candidates before you've even interviewed him or her.
Unconscious bias. Yeah.
It just gives you a reason, you don't even need to know that,
Right.
give yourself to give them a chance to interview and make determinations on their qualifications based on their interview.
Right.
And you both have mentioned that there needs to be a checkmark box at the bottom of each application that says, I attest that all this information is correct. Now, most of the time, applications are going to be online nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
Is it okay for businesses to automatically assume that everything is true and not need that checkbox on their internet page, or should that be included on there no matter what?
The ones I've seen, they typically are. So you're agreeing, and when you're agreeing to also sign, electronically for everything. Whenever I have clients that will utilize just Indeed, but their application isn't actually on the job posting, then that's part of the process of their new hire paperwork. Is when after they go through the interview and everything, then the application is part of their new hire paperwork. Not my preference. It just is the way it is. And sometimes you're utilizing free resources to recruit, which is fine. You don't have the capabilities of like a big, giant, robust internal HRIS or ATS system. So, yeah.
Okay. And we've covered this in another video, but how long should an employer retain applications and resumes even if they don't hire candidates? And what's the reason for that?
1 year. 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
What's the reason for that specifically?
That's the retention requirement by the government. But also, you never know what's going to happen. Maybe that person, somebody in their family they live with, gets a promotion and moved to another state, so they have to go, not necessarily because they did something wrong, or maybe your business has grown and you need to hire a second person, and there was another candidate that almost, made it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Between those two.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
and on top of that, though, again, back to your point too, of if you don't choose someone and someone comes to file a complaint against you, you have that on file, and you can say, well, yes, actually, we did ask these certain questions, or we didn't ask these, so it is your proof. That they did apply.
Yeah, and your proof that I didn't know what age or race or gender they were just looking at their application.
Right.
Which sometimes you can't tell. My daughter's name is Kobe. Most people think that she is a he. So you just never know.
Well, is there anything else y'all want to add that you feel like is also important to this topic?
I feel like we pretty much hashed this one.
Yeah, I think we did.
Hey, that's efficient then. That's always good. Well, guys, thank you again for joining us for another episode of our roundtable discussions, and this time on applications. I feel like we've gotten to learn a lot about why it's important to have certain things on your applications, why you shouldn't just take a resume at face value and that sort of thing. And I think this is going to be something that a lot of businesses really will glean something from.
Thank you.
Thank you again, and have a good day, everyone.